Welcome. You have found your way to this quiet hour. As you settle in, let the weight of the day begin to lift. Let your breathing find its own rhythm. Tonight, we are going to explore how the people of the northern Great Plains survived winter inside structures made of wooden poles and animal hides. For thousands of years, families slept through nights when the temperature outside dropped to 40 degrees below zero. They did this in dwellings that could be assembled in hours and moved across hundreds of miles. The tipi was not a primitive shelter. It was a refined answer to a specific problem: how to stay warm in a landscape that offered no protection from wind or cold. Every element of its design had been tested and adjusted over generations. The angle of the poles, the placement of the fire, the way smoke moved through the interior. These were not accidents, they were solutions. Over the next while, we will move through the engineering of winter survival on the open prairie. We will see how the structure managed heat, how families organised themselves in 12 feet of space, and how a night of sleep was made possible when the world outside was frozen and dark. So, let yourself settle. The story will unfold slowly, one detail at a time. The northern Great Plains stretch from central Canada down to Texas, and from the Rocky Mountains eastward to the Mississippi Valley. This is a landscape defined by distance and exposure. There are no mountain ranges running east to west, no forest dense enough to block the wind. In winter, there is nothing between the Arctic and the ground but cold air moving south. The climate here is called continental. That means it is shaped by land, not water. Large bodies of water moderate temperature. They absorb heat in summer and release it slowly in winter. But the plains are far from any ocean. The air here is dry. Temperature swings are extreme. In a single day, the thermometer can drop 60 degrees. Winter temperatures ranged from 32 degrees Fahrenheit down to 50 below zero. On the coldest nights, the air itself seemed to crack. Metal became brittle. Leather turned stiff. Exposed skin could freeze in less than a minute. The wind was constant. It came from the northwest, sweeping down from the polar regions without obstruction. On the open prairie, wind speed could reach the force of a hurricane. These storms were called blizzards. They brought not only cold, but also disorientation. Snow did not fall so much as it flew horizontally. Visibility dropped to zero. A person could lose their way 10 feet from shelter. The air was dry. Humidity levels in winter were extremely low. This made the cold feel sharper. Dry cold pulls moisture from the skin and lungs faster than wet cold. Frostbite happened quickly. Dehydration was a constant risk, even when surrounded by snow. Snow itself was different here. It was light and crystalline, not wet and heavy. It did not melt easily. It could be compacted into blocks or banked against structures for insulation. The tribes learned to use it as a tool. There was a period in history called the Little Ice Age. It lasted from roughly the 14th century into the 19th. During this time, global temperatures dropped. Winters became longer and harsher. Glaciers advanced. Rivers that never froze began to freeze. For the people of the plains, this meant the systems they had developed for winter survival were tested even further. The landscape offered almost nothing in terms of natural shelter. There were no caves, few valleys deep enough to block the wind. Trees grew only along rivers, and even then they were sparse. The prairie was open in every direction. Sound travelled differently in this environment. The dry air carried noise for miles. The snap of a branch freezing could be heard across a valley. At night, the silence was profound. There was no hum of insects, no rustle of leaves, just wind and the occasional crack of ice forming on a riverbed. This was the environment the tipi was built to answer. Not occasionally, but every year. Not for a few weeks, but for 4 months or more. The question was not whether winter would come, but whether the structure and the people inside it could endure what winter brought. The rhythm of the seasons on the plains was predictable. Summer brought heat and thunderstorms. Autumn was brief, a short window of mild weather before the first snows. Winter arrived suddenly, often in late October or early November. It did not leave until March or April. During the Little Ice Age, winters sometimes began even earlier and lasted longer. There are records in winter counts. pictorial calendars kept by the tribes, of snow falling in September and remaining on the ground until May. These extended winters tested every aspect of the survival systems that had been developed over centuries. The tribes had no choice but to adapt. There was no migration to a warmer climate. The buffalo herds they depended on for food, clothing and shelter remained on the plains through winter. Where the buffalo went, the people followed, and the buffalo stayed, enduring the cold through their own adaptations. Thick fur, the ability to dig through snow to reach grass, and a tendency to gather in sheltered valleys. The human adaptation was the tipi. It was not the only form of shelter used by indigenous peoples in North America. In other regions, people built longhouses, earth lodges, or plank houses. But on the plains, where mobility was essential and wood was scarce, the tipi was the answer. It could be assembled quickly, disassembled just as fast, and transported across vast distances. And critically, it could keep people alive through temperatures that would kill an unprepared person in minutes. Winter on the plains was not just cold. It was isolating. Storms could last for days. During a blizzard, leaving the tipi was impossible. Visibility dropped to nothing. The wind was too strong to walk against. Even if you managed to get outside, you could become disoriented within seconds and freeze to death a few yards from shelter. The isolation meant that preparation was everything. By the time winter arrived, every family needed to have enough food stored to last months, enough fuel gathered to keep a fire burning day and night, enough materials to repair the tipi if it was damaged. There was no running to a neighbour's lodge in the middle of a blizzard. Each family had to be self-sufficient. The Plains tribes understood this. They had systems for ensuring that no one entered winter unprepared. The autumn hunts were communal efforts. When a buffalo was killed, the meat was distributed according to need. Families with many children received more. Elders who could no longer hunt were provided for. The goal was not individual wealth, but collective survival. This was the landscape. This was the climate. This was the reality that shaped every decision about how to build a shelter, how to manage fire, and how to organize the interior of a dwelling. The tipi was not invented in a single moment. It was refined over thousands of years, each generation making small adjustments based on what worked and what failed. By the time European observers first saw these structures in the 18th and 19th centuries, the tipi had reached a state of near perfection. It was a technology as sophisticated as any developed anywhere in the world. From a distance, the tipi appeared as a simple cone rising from the snow. But nothing about its shape was arbitrary. The structure was not symmetrical. If you stood outside and looked at it carefully, you would notice that the rear wall was steeper than the front. The peak of the cone was not centered. It leaned slightly back, away from the door. This tilt was deliberate. The prevailing wind on the plains came from the west or northwest. By angling the rear wall into a steeper pitch, the structure became more aerodynamic. Wind hitting the back of the tipi was deflected upward and over, rather than pushing against a flat surface. The shallow front wall, facing east, provided more headroom inside and positioned the smoke hole directly above the fire. The entire structure rested on the ground without anchoring. There were no stakes driven into frozen earth. Instead, the weight of the cover and the interlocking pressure of the poles held everything in place. When wind struck the tipi, the force did not lift it. The design turned that force downward, pressing the structure more firmly into the ground. This shape also managed snow accumulation. Snow that landed on the steep rear slope slid off rather than building up. On the shallower front, any accumulation could be cleared easily. If snow was allowed to pile up on a roof, the added weight could collapse the frame. The tipi's geometry prevented this. The door faced east. This was not a spiritual choice alone, though it had spiritual meaning. Facing east meant the door opened away from the prevailing wind. It also meant the first light of morning entered directly, helping to warm the interior after the coldest part of the night. The size of the tipi was limited by the materials available. The longest poles that could be harvested and transported were about 20 feet. This determined the maximum diameter of the base, which was typically 12 to 15 feet. Any larger, and the poles would not meet at the top. Any smaller, and there would not be enough room for a family and their stored supplies. From the outside, the cover appeared smooth, but it was not a single piece of material. It was made from multiple buffalo hides sewn together. The seams were visible if you looked closely. Each seam represented hours of work. The hides had to be cut to fit the conical shape. The edges had to align perfectly, or gaps would let in wind and cold. At the top of the cone, 2 flaps extended outward like ears. These were the smoke flaps. They could be adjusted using poles from the outside. Depending on the wind direction, the flaps would be angled to create a low pressure zone over the smoke hole. This drew smoke upward and out of the dwelling, even in a storm. The base of the teepee was often weighted down with snow or stones. In winter, snow was banked around the entire perimeter, forming a seal against the ground. This prevented cold air from seeping in underneath the cover. The structure had no windows, no secondary openings. The only way in or out was through the single door flap. This was a piece of hide hung from the top and weighted at the bottom. It could be tied shut from the inside. When closed, the interior became almost completely sealed. Looking at the teepee from the outside, you would see a functional object. No decoration on the exterior in winter, though some covers were painted with symbols in warmer months. In winter, the focus was entirely on performance. The teepee needed to shed wind, manage snow and hold heat. Everything else was secondary. The cone shape itself was significant for heat management. Warm air rises. In a conical space, the warmest air collects at the top near the smoke hole. Cooler air sinks to the floor. By controlling the opening at the top, the occupants could regulate how much heat escaped and how much stayed inside. This was not possible with a flat roof or a domed structure. The cone allowed for precise control. From a distance, a winter camp might have a dozen or more tippies arranged in a circle. This was called the sacred hoop. The circle provided a communal windbreak. The tippies on the windward side took the brunt of the wind, while those on the leeward side were partially sheltered. The arrangement also created a central space for gathering, though in the coldest months people rarely left their individual lodges. The teepee did not resist the environment, it worked with it. The wind that threatened to tear it apart was the same wind that pulled smoke from the fire. The snow that could bury it was used to insulate it. The cold that made the hide stiff also made it airtight. Every challenge presented by the Winter Prairie had been studied, and the structure had been shaped in response. This was not a tent. It was a machine for surviving winter. The visual simplicity of the teepee was deceptive. From the outside, it appeared to be nothing more than a cone of animal hide. But that simplicity was the result of eliminating everything that did not work. Every curve, every angle, every measurement had been tested against the harshest conditions on Earth. The height of the structure mattered. A teepee that was too tall would be unstable in high winds. The peak would sway too much, and the poles could separate at the top. A teepee that was too short would not have enough interior space and would trap smoke near the occupants' heads. The standard height, roughly 12 to 15 feet at the peak, represented the optimal balance. The diameter at the base also had limits. A very wide teepee would require longer poles, which were difficult to transport and harder to control in wind. A narrow teepee would not provide enough floor space for sleeping, storage, and daily activities. The typical base diameter of 12 to 15 feet allowed for a functional interior without compromising structural integrity. The door itself was minimal, a single flap of hide that could be tied open or closed. In winter, it remained closed almost all the time. When someone needed to enter or exit, they lifted the flap quickly and moved through, minimizing the amount of cold air that entered. Some tippies had a second, smaller flap that could be opened for ventilation without exposing the entire doorway. The placement of the door on the east side had practical benefits beyond avoiding the prevailing wind. Morning sunlight entered directly, warming the interior at the start of the day. This was critical. The coldest part of the night was just before dawn. As the fire burned down to coals, the interior temperature would drop. The first rays of sun provided a small but meaningful boost to warmth. The smoke hole at the top was not a simple opening. It was shaped by the smoke flaps, which could be adjusted to change the size and direction of the opening. In calm weather, the flaps could be spread wide, allowing maximum ventilation. In a storm, they could be drawn nearly closed, leaving only a small gap for smoke to escape. The engineering of the smoke flaps was subtle. They were not flat pieces of hide. They were cut and shaped so that when the poles moved them into position, they curved slightly. This curvature helped direct airflow. It also prevented the flaps from flapping violently in high winds, which could damage the cover or create noise that made sleep difficult. The structure had no internal supports other than the poles that formed the frame. There were no crossbeams, no interior posts. This meant the entire floor space was usable. The only fixed element inside was the fire pit, which was a shallow depression dug into the earth at the centre, or slightly forward of centre. In winter, the exterior of the teepee would often be covered in frost or a thin layer of ice. This happened when the moisture from inside the structure, breath, steam from cooking, passed through the hide and froze on the outer surface. The frost was not a problem, it actually added a thin layer of insulation. As long as the hide remained intact and the seams held, the frost was a sign that the system was working. The frame of the teepee began with trees. Not just any trees, but a specific type, lodgepole pine. These trees grew in the mountains, particularly in the ranges west of the plains. They were harvested in the spring when the sap was running. Lodgepole pines have certain qualities. They grow straight. This is critical. A bent or twisted pole cannot be used in a conical structure where every piece must angle toward a single point. The trees are also slender, which makes them light enough to transport. And they are strong. A lodgepole pine can support significant weight without snapping. Harvesting happened in late spring or early summer. The bark was peeled while the sap was still flowing, which made the process easier. The poles were then left to season. Green wood is heavy and flexible. Seasoned wood is lighter and holds its shape. By the time the poles were needed for a winter camp, they had dried for months. The length of the poles determined the size of the teepee. Most poles were between 15 and 20 feet long. Longer poles were difficult to transport. Shorter poles created a structure too small for a family. 20 feet was the practical maximum. The foundation of the teepee could be built in one of two ways. The first method used 3 poles arranged in a tripod. The second used 4 poles in a quadrupod. The choice depended on the tribe and the local conditions. The tripod method was common among the Lakota and Cheyenne. 3 poles were lashed together near one end using rawhide. The binding had to be tight. If the poles slipped, the entire structure would collapse. Once lashed, the poles were raised together. One person held the bound end while others lifted the opposite ends, spreading them out to form a stable base. The geometry of the tripod was specific. The poles did not form an equilateral triangle. The arrangement was slightly asymmetrical. One pole, called the door pole, was positioned to the southeast. The other 2, the North Pole and South Pole, were set to resist the prevailing wind from the west. This created a structure that leaned slightly backward. The quadrupod method, used by the Blackfoot and Crow, started with 4 poles. These were also lashed together, but the binding was more complex. The 4 poles had to be balanced so that no single pole bore too much weight. Once raised, the quadrupod provided a wider base and more interior space. It was also more stable in extremely high winds. After the foundation was set, additional poles were added. The total number varied, but it was usually between 15 and 25. Each pole was leaned into the junction at the top, where the original poles were bound. The poles were added in a clockwise sequence. This was not arbitrary. The sequence created a locking effect. Each new pole pressed against the previous one, tightening the structure. The placement of each pole mattered. Poles were not evenly spaced. Some areas of the frame needed more support than others. The rear of the teepee, where the wind hit hardest, had poles placed closer together. The front, where the door would be, had a wider gap. 2 additional poles were longer and more slender than the rest. These were the smoke flap poles. They were not part of the main frame. Instead, they were inserted into pockets sewn into the smoke flaps and extended outside the structure. By moving these poles, the occupants could adjust the position of the flaps without leaving the teepee. The strongest pole was reserved for lifting the cover onto the frame. This was called the lifting pole. The hide cover was attached to it while still on the ground. The pole was then raised and the cover was draped over the frame. Once in place, the cover was wrapped around the structure and pinned together at the front with wooden stakes or bone pins. The frame, once complete, was rigid. You could push against it, and it would not move. The interlocking pressure of the poles created a structure that was both flexible and strong. In a windstorm, the frame would sway slightly, absorbing the force rather than breaking. The poles themselves required maintenance. Over time, they would wear at the points where they rubbed against each other. The tips, where they met at the top, would splinter. Damaged poles had to be replaced. This meant that even in winter, if a pole cracked, someone had to venture out to find a replacement or repair the frame from inside. The base of each pole rested directly on the ground. There were no sockets or supports. The angle of the pole and the weight of the cover kept it in place. If the ground was uneven, small stones or packed earth were used to level the base. The frame was not permanent. It could be disassembled in less than an hour. The poles were bundled and dragged to the next camp. In winter, this happened rarely. Moving a camp in deep snow was difficult and dangerous, but the possibility remained. The tipi was designed to be mobile, even in the harshest conditions. The wood itself had a smell. Fresh lodgepole pine carried a faint resinous scent. Older poles, dried and seasoned, smelled of smoke from years of use. Inside the tipi, the smell of the wood mixed with the smell of the fire and the hides. It became part of the sensory environment of winter. The frame was the skeleton of the structure. Without it, there was no shelter. But the frame alone did nothing to keep out the cold. For that, the tipi needed its skin. The cover of the tipi was made from buffalo hides. Not a single hide, but many, usually between 8 and 20, depending on the size of the structure. These hides were sewn together to form a single continuous piece that wrapped around the frame. The selection of hides was precise. Not every buffalo hide was suitable for a tipi cover. The best hides came from young cows, killed in late fall or early winter. At that time of year, the hair was thick, and the leather was at its most pliable. Hides from old bulls were too thick and difficult to work. Hides from calves were too thin, and would not hold up to the stress of wind and weather. Each hide had to be processed. This work was done almost entirely by women. It was not a task that could be rushed. A poorly tanned hide would stiffen in the cold, crack in the wind, and let water through. A well-tanned hide would remain soft, shed water, and last for years. The first step was scraping. The hide was stretched flat on the ground and pegged at the edges. Using a blade made from bone or metal, the worker scraped away all the fat and membrane from the flesh side. This had to be done carefully. Too much pressure, and the blade would cut through the leather. Too little, and the fat would remain, causing the hide to rot. Next came thinning. This was the most critical part of the process. The hide had to be chipped away until it was of uniform thickness. Thick spots would be stiff and heavy. Thin spots would be weak and prone to tearing. The worker judged thickness by feel, running their hands over the leather again and again. Once the hide was thinned, it was treated with a mixture made from the animal's own brain and liver. This mixture was emulsified with water and worked into the fibres of the leather. The lipids in the brain tissue acted as a natural tanning agent. They coated each fibre, preventing them from sticking together as the hide dried. This is one of the oldest tanning methods known. It is also one of the most effective. Brain-tanned leather is soft, breathable and non-toxic. It does not harden when it gets wet as rawhide does. Instead, it dries soft, ready to be used again. After the brain mixture was applied, the hide was worked. This meant pulling it, stretching it, rubbing it over a rope or wooden edge. The physical effort prevented the fibres from bonding as they dried. A hide that was not worked would dry into a stiff, useless sheet. A hide that was worked properly would dry into something that felt almost like cloth. The final step was smoking. The hide was suspended over a slow fire, usually made from rotted wood or punky material that produced thick smoke but little flame. The smoke contained carbon and resins. These chemicals bonded with the fibres of the leather, sealing them. A smoked hide could get wet and still dry soft. An unsmoked hide would revert to rawhide when wet, becoming hard and brittle. The entire process, from raw hide to finished leather, could take a week or more per hide. For a tipi cover requiring 15 hides, this represented months of labour. Once the hides were tanned, they had to be sewn together. The seams were made with sinew, the dried tendon from a buffalo or deer. Sinew is incredibly strong. When wet, it becomes pliable and easy to thread through a bone or metal awl. As it dries, it shrinks and tightens, creating a seam that is nearly as strong as the leather itself. The hides were cut to fit the conical shape of the tipi. The pattern was not written down. It was learned by doing, passed from mother to daughter over generations. The pieces had to fit together with almost no gaps. A poorly cut cover would have spaces where wind could enter or smoke could escape in the wrong places. The finished cover was attached to the lifting pole and raised onto the frame. It wrapped around the structure, overlapping at the front to form a door. The overlap was pinned together with wooden stakes that slid through loops, sewn into the hide. In winter, the cover was often doubled. A second layer of hides, or sometimes a layer of canvas if it was available, was placed over the first. This created additional insulation and protected the inner layer from wear. The bottom edge of the cover did not reach the ground. It stopped a few inches above the earth. This gap was intentional. It allowed fresh air to enter the tipi at ground level. This air was drawn upward by the fire and the chimney effect created by the inner liner. Without this gap, the fire would suffocate. In winter, the gap was sealed with banked snow or bundles of grass. This prevented drafts while still allowing a controlled flow of air through the structure. The cover was not waterproof in the way a modern tent is waterproof. It was water resistant. Light rain or snow would bead on the surface and run off. Heavy rain could soak through, but the smoking process ensured that the leather did not become heavy or lose its shape. The cover also breathed. Unlike a plastic or rubber membrane, the leather allowed moisture from inside the tipi to escape slowly. This prevented condensation from building up on the interior walls. In a sealed structure, the moisture from human breath and the fire would condense into ice on the walls. In the tipi, the moisture passed through the hide and dissipated into the outside air. The hide itself had texture. It was not smooth. You could see the grain of the original skin. The hair side faced outward in winter, providing additional insulation. The flesh side faced inward, creating a slightly softer surface that did not collect soot as easily. The cover required constant maintenance. Seams loosened over time and had to be resewn. Small tears had to be patched. Hides that became too worn had to be replaced. This work continued through the winter. Even in the coldest months, there was always repair to be done. The cover was not just a barrier against the wind, it was a living part of the structure, responding to temperature and moisture, expanding and contracting with the weather. It was the skin of the tipi, and like skin, it required care to remain functional. The weight of the cover was significant. 15 buffalo hides, even after tanning, could weigh well over 100 pounds when dry. When wet, the weight nearly doubled. This meant that raising the cover required strength and coordination. Usually several people worked together to attach it to the lifting pole and maneuver it into position. The colour of the cover changed with age and use. Fresh hides were a light tan or cream colour. After months of smoke exposure, they darkened to a rich brown. Some covers, used for many years, became almost black. The darkening was a record of use, a visible marker of how many fires had burned inside. In some communities, the exterior of the cover was painted with symbols during the warmer months. These paintings had meaning. They might represent a vision, a significant event, or the status of the family. But in winter, decoration was secondary. The painted covers were often replaced with unpainted ones that were newer and more weatherproof. The painted covers were stored, protected from the elements, until spring. The cover was the property of the woman who made it. This was not a casual arrangement. It was a legal and social reality. A woman who could tan hides and construct a tipi cover possessed valuable skills and owned a valuable object. If a marriage dissolved, the woman kept the tipi. The man would leave, taking only his personal possessions. The attachment points on the cover had to be reinforced. At the top, where the lifting pole was tied, the leather experienced constant stress from wind pulling on the structure. These areas were doubled or tripled with additional layers of hide to prevent tearing. The smoke flaps, the two triangular extensions at the top, were sewn as part of the cover. Each flap had a pocket along its outer edge. The smoke flap poles slid into these pockets, allowing the flaps to be moved from outside without damaging the cover. The edges of the flaps were often reinforced with extra stitching, as they took the most abuse from wind. When the cover was not in use, During the summer months when the tribe might live in brush shelters or other temporary structures, it was folded carefully and stored in a dry place. Mice and insects could damage stored hides, so the cover was often hung from poles or placed on a raised platform. Moisture was the greatest enemy. A hide that stayed wet would rot. Proper storage ensured the cover lasted through multiple winters. The smell of the cover was distinct. The combination of brain-tanned leather and wood smoke created an odour that was earthy and slightly sweet. It was not unpleasant. It was the smell of home, familiar and constant. In winter, that smell filled the interior of the tipi, mixing with the scent of burning wood and cooking food. The cover was more than shelter. It was the product of immense labour, specific knowledge, and careful material selection. It represented the investment of an entire community in the survival of a single family. Without it, the frame was useless. Without it, there was no protection from the winter that surrounded everything. Inside the tipi there was a second layer of hides that most people from outside the culture never saw. This was called the inner liner, or dew cloth. It hung from the interior poles reaching from the ground to a height of about 6 feet. The liner did not touch the outer cover. There was a gap of several inches between the two layers. This gap was not empty. It was filled with air, and that air was constantly moving. Air entered the tipi at ground level, through the small gap between the bottom of the outer cover and the earth. This incoming air was cold. It moved along the floor and then rose, pulled upward by the heat from the fire. As it rose, it travelled through the space, between the liner and the outer cover. Eventually it reached the top of the structure and exited through the smoke hole. This movement of air was called the chimney effect. It worked through convection. Warm air is less dense than cold air, so it rises. Cold air, being denser, sinks. By creating a channel for this movement, the tipi turned a simple physical principle into a ventilation system. The chimney effect had several functions. First, it pulled smoke from the fire upward and out of the dwelling. Without this current, smoke would accumulate in the living space, making it difficult to breathe and eventually forcing the occupants outside. Second, it created a barrier of moving air that helped insulate the interior. The cold air coming in at the bottom never reached the living space directly. It was channeled between the layers and expelled at the top. Third, the system managed moisture. Human breath contains water vapour. In winter, when people exhaled inside a sealed space, moisture would condense on the coldest surfaces, usually the walls. In a structure without ventilation, condensation would freeze, creating a layer of ice on the interior walls. The tipi's ventilation allowed this moisture to escape before it could condense. The liner itself was made from additional buffalo hides or, in later periods, canvas. It was not sewn into a single piece like the outer cover. Instead, it was composed of several panels that could be adjusted or replaced individually. The bottom edge of the liner rested on the ground or was weighted with stones. The top edge was tied to the poles. The liner also served as a privacy screen and a shield against drafts. Even with the chimney effect working properly, there were moments when cold air moved unpredictably, when the door was opened, or when wind gusted from an unusual direction. The liner protected the living space from these sudden intrusions. In the coldest months, some families added a third layer. This might be old, hides that were no longer suitable for the outer cover, or it might be woven mats made from cattail reeds or willow bark. Any additional layer added insulation and reduced heat loss. The pocket of air between the outer cover and the liner was called dead air. Dead air does not circulate. It sits still, trapped between two surfaces. Still air is an excellent insulator. It prevents heat from transferring through conduction. This is the same principle used in modern double-pane windows. The glass does not provide much insulation, but the layer of trapped air between the panes does. The thickness of the air gap mattered. If the liner was too close to the outer cover, there was not enough space for air to move freely and the chimney effect weakened. If the liner was too far from the cover, the dead air pocket became too large and began to circulate on its own, reducing its insulating value. The optimal distance was a few inches, close enough to trap air, far enough to allow movement. Liner was not uniform in height all the way around the tipi. At the rear, where people slept, it extended higher, sometimes reaching 7 or 8 feet. This provided more protection in the area where warmth was most needed. At the front near the door it was lower, allowing easier access and movement. Some tipis also had an ozan, an overhead covering that hung from the poles like a partial ceiling. The ozan was positioned above the sleeping area at the rear of the lodge. It was made from hide and angled slightly downward toward the fire. The ozan served as a radiant heat reflector. Heat from the fire rose toward the smoke hole, but much of it was in the form of infrared radiation. This radiation moved in straight lines from the fire. When it struck the ozan, it was reflected back downward toward the people sleeping below. This kept the sleeping area significantly warmer than it would have been otherwise. The ozan also caught any moisture that seeped through the outer cover. Rain or snow that melted on the exterior and dripped down the poles would hit the ozan and run along its surface to the edges, where it dripped harmlessly behind the liner. This kept the bedding dry. Not every teepee had an ozan. It was an additional piece of equipment that required extra hides and more setup time. But in the coldest regions, particularly among tribes in the northern plains and Canada, the ozan was standard. The entire ventilation system required constant adjustment. The smoke flaps had to be repositioned based on wind direction. If the wind shifted, the low pressure zone over the smoke hole would disappear, and smoke would begin to fill the interior. Someone had to go outside, move the smoke flap poles and redirect the flaps. On calm days, when there was no wind to create the low pressure zone, the chimney effect relied entirely on the temperature difference between the inside and outside air. The greater the difference, the stronger the draft. On very cold days, the draft was strong. On milder days, it was weaker, and smoke might linger longer before exiting. The system was not automatic. It required knowledge and attention. Children learned by watching their parents adjust the flaps, by noticing when smoke began to accumulate, by understanding the relationship between wind direction and smoke movement. This knowledge was as essential as knowing how to start a fire or prepare food. The inner liner, the dead air gap, the chimney effect, the ozan. These were not separate elements. They were parts of a single integrated system. Each piece depended on the others. Remove one, and the whole system became less effective. Together, they created an interior environment that could remain at 60 to 70 degrees Fahrenheit, while the temperature outside dropped to 40 below zero. Heat moves in three ways: conduction, convection, and radiation. The teepee managed all three. Conduction is the transfer of heat through direct contact. If you place your hand on a cold piece of metal, heat flows from your hand into the metal. You feel cold because you are losing heat. The teepee minimized conductive heat loss by creating barriers. The outer hide cover, the dead air gap, and the inner liner all interrupted the path of heat trying to escape from the interior. Air is a poor conductor of heat. That is why trapped air is such an effective insulator. The air between the liner and the cover could not carry heat away through conduction, because it was not moving. It just sat there, holding a middle temperature between the warm interior and the freezing exterior. Convection is the transfer of heat through moving air or liquid. Warm air rises, carrying heat with it. In the teepee, convection was deliberately channeled. The chimney effect used convection to remove smoke, but it also meant that some heat was lost as warm air exited through the smoke hole. This was unavoidable. Without the smoke hole, there would be no way to burn a fire. The trade-off was managed by controlling the size of the opening and by reflecting radiant heat back into the living space. Radiation is the transfer of heat through electromagnetic waves. This is how the sun warms the earth, even though space is a vacuum and there is no air to carry the heat. A fire radiates heat in all directions. This radiation can be felt on your skin from several feet away. It does not require air to travel. It moves in straight lines until it strikes an object, which then absorbs the energy and becomes warmer. The fire in the center of the teepee radiated heat outward. Some of that heat was absorbed by the people sitting around the fire. Some was absorbed by the hides of the liner and outer cover, and some was reflected. The ozan, positioned above the sleeping area, was angled to catch the radiant heat rising from the fire and send it back down toward the occupants. This was similar to how a reflector behind a candle can direct more light in a specific direction. The ozan did not create heat. It simply redirected heat that would otherwise have escaped through the smoke hole. The effectiveness of the ozan depended on its angle and position. If it was too flat, the heat would strike it and continue upward without significant reflection. If it was too steep, it would block the chimney effect and trap smoke in the living area. The correct angle was learned through experience. The materials used in the teepee also affected heat retention. Buffalo hide has natural insulating properties. The hair, even when on the outside of the cover, trapped a thin layer of air. This added a small amount of insulation. More importantly, the hide was thick enough to slow the transfer of heat, without being so thick that it became heavy and unmanageable. Inside, the ground itself played a role. Earth is a thermal mass. During the day, when the fire was burning, the ground around the fire pit absorbed heat. At night, as the fire died down, the ground slowly released that heat back into the air. This was a small effect, but in an environment where every bit of warmth mattered, it contributed to survival. The floor of the teepee was not bare earth for the entire surface. The central area around the fire was left open, but the sleeping and sitting areas were covered with layers of material. First, dried grasses or sage were spread on the ground. These provided a soft base and a small amount of insulation from the frozen earth below. On top of the grasses, hides were laid flat. These hides were often older ones that were no longer suitable for clothing or covers, but were still functional as ground insulation. The combination of grass and hide created a barrier between the occupants and the ground. Without this barrier, body heat would be conducted directly into the earth, which acts as an enormous heat sink. A person lying on frozen ground will lose heat rapidly, even if the air around them is warm. The layered floor prevented this. Willow beds were another form of insulation. These were raised platforms made from peeled willow rods lashed together. The rods were supported by a frame that kept them several inches off the ground. Air could circulate beneath the bed, preventing moisture from accumulating and providing additional insulation. The willow rods themselves were slightly flexible, which made the bed more comfortable than lying on a hard surface. During the day, the bed could be leaned against the wall to create a backrest. At night, it was laid flat and covered with buffalo robes for sleeping. Buffalo robes were the final layer of the insulation system. A buffalo robe is a hide that has been tanned with the hair left on. The hair side faced inward, against the body. The thick fur of a buffalo is one of the most effective natural insulators known. The individual hairs are hollow, which means they trap air. The dense undercoat prevents heat from escaping. Wrapped in a buffalo robe, a person could sleep comfortably even when the temperature inside the teepee dropped to near freezing. Most people use multiple robes. One was placed on the willow bed as a mattress, another was used as a blanket. In the coldest weather, a third robe might be added. The robes overlapped, creating a cocoon of warmth. The heat generated by the human body was sufficient to warm this small space. An adult at rest produces roughly the same amount of heat as a 100-watt light bulb. Wrapped in buffalo robes and insulated from the ground, that heat had nowhere to go. It stayed with the body, creating a microclimate that could be 30 or 40 degrees warmer than the surrounding air. Children often slept together, sharing robes. This was not just for warmth, though that was a benefit. It was also practical. A family of 8 or 10 people in a 12-foot diameter teepee had limited space. Shared sleeping arrangements maximised the usable area. Heated stones were sometimes used to extend warmth into the night. Large stones were placed in the fire and allowed to heat for hours. Once they were glowing hot, they were carefully removed using wooden tongs or sticks and placed in the corners of the teepee, away from anything flammable. These stones radiated heat for hours as they slowly cooled. They were particularly useful in the coldest part of the night, when the fire had burned down to coals and was producing less heat. The management of heat in the teepee was a continuous process. During the day, when people were active and the fire was burning steadily, the interior could become quite warm. Adjustments were made to prevent overheating. The smoke flaps were opened wider, or the door flap was lifted slightly to allow more air circulation. At night, as activity decreased and the fire was reduced to coals, the focus shifted to retaining as much heat as possible. The smoke flaps were narrowed, the door flap was sealed, and everyone wrapped themselves in robes. The difference between life and death in winter could come down to understanding these principles. A person who did not know how to manage the fire, how to position the liner, or how to use robes effectively could freeze even inside a well-constructed teepee. The knowledge was not written down. It was taught through observation and practice, passed from one generation to the next. At the top of the teepee, where the poles converged, the cover did not close into a single point. Instead, it formed an opening, and on either side of that opening were two triangular flaps of hide. These were the smoke flaps, sometimes called ears. The smoke flaps were not fixed in place. Each flap had a pocket sewn along its outer edge, and into this pocket was inserted a long, slender pole. These poles extended down the outside of the teepee, where they could be moved by someone standing on the ground. The purpose of the smoke flaps was to control the smoke hole. By adjusting the position of the flaps, the occupants could change the size of the opening and the direction it faced. This allowed them to work with the wind rather than against it. Wind creates pressure differences. When wind flows over an object, it moves faster over the top than around the sides. Faster moving air has lower pressure. This is the same principle that allows airplane wings to generate lift. By positioning the smoke flaps so that the wind flowed across the opening, the occupants created a low-pressure zone directly above the smoke hole. This low pressure pulled air upward from inside the teepee, drawing smoke out. On a windy day, this system worked powerfully. The smoke was pulled out almost as soon as it rose from the fire. On a calm day, the system relied more on the natural buoyancy of warm air. The smoke still exited, but more slowly. The direction of the wind determined how the flaps should be positioned. If the wind came from the west, the flaps were angled to open toward the east, creating a vacuum on the downwind side of the opening. If the wind shifted to the north, the flaps were adjusted accordingly. This required constant attention. Wind on the plains was rarely steady. It gusted and shifted direction throughout the day. Someone had to monitor the smoke inside the teepee and adjust the flaps as needed. In a family group, this task often fell to the children, or to whoever was nearest the door. The poles used to adjust the flaps were longer than the other poles in the structure. They had to extend from the top of the teepee down to the ground, where they could be reached. They were also more slender, which made them easier to move, but also more prone to breaking in high winds. Replacing a broken smoke flap pole in the middle of a winter storm was difficult and dangerous, so these poles were selected carefully and maintained with extra care. In extreme weather, when winds reached dangerous speeds, the smoke flaps could be drawn almost entirely closed. A small gap was left for smoke to escape, but the opening was minimised to prevent wind from entering the teepee and creating a downdraft that would blow smoke back into the living space. There were also times when the flaps needed to be closed completely. During heavy snow or freezing rain, moisture could enter through the smoke hole and fall directly onto the fire or onto the people below. Closing the flaps temporarily was preferable to having the fire extinguished or the interior soaked. However, this could only be done for short periods. Without ventilation, smoke would accumulate quickly. The design of the flaps themselves was important. They were not simple rectangles. They were cut in a specific shape that allowed them to curve when the poles were moved. This curvature helped direct airflow and prevented the flaps from collapsing inward or flapping violently. The edges of the flaps were reinforced with extra stitching. This was one of the most stressed parts of the entire cover. Wind pulling on the flaps created tension on the seams. Over time, this tension could cause tearing. Regular inspection and repair were necessary. The flaps were often the first part of the cover to show wear. After several seasons, they might need to be replaced even if the rest of the cover was still functional. This was done by cutting away the old flaps and sewing on new ones. The work required skill. The new flaps had to match the existing cover precisely, or gaps would form. In some tribes, the smoke flap poles were decorated. The Blackfoot, in particular, sometimes painted these poles or attached feathers to them. This was not purely decorative. The decorations served as markers, making it easier to distinguish which pole controlled which flap, especially in low light or during a storm when visibility was poor. The smoke hole and its flaps represented one of the most sophisticated elements of teepee design. It was a dynamic system, constantly adjusted to match changing conditions. It required knowledge, attention, and physical effort. But it was this system that made it possible to burn a fire inside a hide-covered structure without suffocating the occupants. Without the smoke flaps, the teepee would not have worked. The fire could not be maintained, and without fire, survival through winter was impossible. The flaps were small, simple pieces of hide, but they were as essential as any part of the structure. The fire was the centre of life inside the tipi. It provided heat, light, and the means to prepare food. It also served as the focal point of the social space. Everything in the tipi was organised in relation to the fire. The fire pit was a shallow depression dug into the earth, usually about 6 inches deep and 2 to 3 feet across. The pit was not lined with stones in the way that some fire pits are in other cultures. The earth itself was sufficient. The bottom of the pit was bare soil, and the sides were simply the edges of the hole. The fire was built directly on the soil. Kindling was arranged first: dry grass, shredded bark, small twigs. These materials caught easily and provided the initial flame. Larger pieces of wood were added gradually, building the fire up to a sustainable size. The type of wood mattered. On the plains, wood was not abundant. Trees grew primarily along rivers and streams. The most common firewood was cottonwood, which was readily available but burned quickly and produced relatively little heat. Willow was also used, though it was even less efficient than cottonwood. When possible, harder woods were preferred. Ash and oak, when available, burned hotter and longer. But these woods were rare on the plains. Most families had to make do with whatever could be gathered from the nearest river bottom. Deadfall was collected throughout the year and stored for winter. By the time the first snow fell, a family needed to have several cords of wood stacked near the tipi. This wood had to be kept dry. Wet wood produces more smoke and less heat. It also creates creosote, which can build up on the interior of the tipi cover and create a fire hazard. The size of the fire varied depending on the time of day and the temperature outside. During the day, when people were active and the tipi needed to be warm enough for work, the fire was larger. Flames rose a foot or more above the pit, and the heat radiated outward, warming the entire interior. At night, the fire was reduced. This was not simply a matter of letting it burn down naturally. It was a deliberate process. Large logs were placed on the fire in the evening and allowed to burn until they collapsed into a bed of coals. These coals were then spread evenly across the bottom of the fire pit. A bed of coals produces a different kind of heat than flames. Flames generate heat through combustion, the rapid oxidation of wood releasing energy. This heat is intense but localized. Coals, on the other hand, radiate heat steadily over a long period. The glow of coals is the visible light produced by their high temperature. That temperature can remain above 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit for hours, even though there are no visible flames. The radiant heat from coals was ideal for sleeping. It warmed the air gently and consistently, without the fluctuations that came from a flaming fire. It also produced almost no smoke, which meant the smoke hole could be partially closed to retain more heat. Managing the transition from day fire to night fire required skill. If the fire was reduced too early, the tipi would become cold before everyone was ready to sleep. If it was reduced too late, fuel was wasted. The timing had to account for the outside temperature, the wind, and the number of people in the tipi. The fire also required tending through the night. Even a well-prepared bed of coals would eventually cool. Someone had to wake periodically and add a small piece of wood to keep the coals alive. This was usually the responsibility of an adult, often the eldest person in the lodge, who slept more lightly and was accustomed to waking at intervals. In the coldest weather, when temperatures dropped to 40 or 50 below zero, the fire could not be allowed to go out completely. Rekindling a fire from nothing in such conditions was extremely difficult. The tinder would be frozen, hands would lose dexterity in seconds, and the initial flames might not generate enough heat to sustain combustion. It was far easier to maintain a continuous fire, even if only as a small bed of coals, than to start fresh each morning. The fire pit was positioned slightly forward of the geometric centre of the tipi. This placement ensured that smoke rose directly through the smoke hole, rather than drifting toward the rear of the structure where people slept. It also meant that the warmest area of the tipi, the space immediately around the fire, was accessible from all sides. The area around the fire pit was kept clear. There were no stored items, no bedding, nothing that could accidentally catch fire. This was a strict rule. Children learned early that the space around the fire was not for playing or sitting carelessly. Sparks were a constant concern. Dry wood, especially cottonwood, tends to pop and send small embers into the air. These sparks could land on clothing, bedding, or the hides of the liner. A single spark that went unnoticed could smoulder for minutes before bursting into flame. Everyone in the teepee remained alert to this danger. The fire also served as a timekeeper. People could judge the passage of time by how much the fire had burned down, how much wood remained, and how the coals looked. In a world without clocks, this was a practical way to organise the day and night. Fire was not taken for granted. Starting a fire required effort and materials. In the coldest months, preserving fire was easier than creating it. Some families kept a fire burning continuously from the first snowfall until spring, never allowing it to go out completely. The fire was more than a tool, it was the heartbeat of the teepee. As long as it burned, there was warmth, safety, and life. As darkness settled over the prairie, the routines inside the teepee shifted towards sleep. The evening meal had been prepared and eaten. The fire, which had been burning brightly for cooking, was now allowed to settle. The flames diminished. The wood broke apart and collapsed into the fire pit. What remained was a mass of glowing coals, deep red and orange, pulsing faintly with heat. This was the night fire. It was not built for light or for cooking. It was built for one purpose, to radiate warmth through the long, frozen hours until dawn. The process of creating the night fire began in the late afternoon. Large pieces of wood, the thickest and densest available, were placed on the existing fire. These pieces were not meant to catch quickly. They were positioned to burn slowly, collapsing gradually over several hours. As the wood burned, it charred on the outside while the interior remained solid. The charred layer insulated the unburned wood, slowing the combustion. Eventually the outer layer would burn through, and the wood would split, releasing more fuel to the fire. This process repeated until the entire piece had been reduced to coals. By the time night fully arrived, the fire pit contained a thick bed of these coals. The bed was several inches deep, spread evenly across the bottom of the pit. There were no flames, or only the smallest flickers where a pocket of gas escaped from a piece of charred wood. The heat from this bed was intense. If you held your hand a foot above the coals, you could feel the warmth immediately. At 2 feet, it was still noticeable. The coals radiated infrared energy in all directions. This energy travelled through the air and was absorbed by anything it struck. The people in the teepee, the hides of the liner, the willow beds, the walls. The temperature inside the teepee during the night depended on several factors. The size of the coal bed was the most obvious. A larger bed produced more heat. But there were others. The outside temperature, the strength of the wind, the condition of the cover and liner, and how tightly the smoke hole had been adjusted. On a moderately cold night, when the outside temperature was around 0 degrees Fahrenheit, the interior might remain at 50 or 60 degrees. On the coldest nights, when the thermometer dropped to 40 below, the interior might fall to 30 or 40 degrees. This was still far warmer than outside, but it was cold enough that without proper bedding, a person could suffer from hypothermia. The coal bed required maintenance. Coals do not burn indefinitely. As they radiate heat, they lose energy and cool. Eventually they turn to ash. To prevent this, small pieces of wood were added throughout the night. This task was delicate. Adding too much wood would cause the fire to flare up, producing smoke and light that would disturb sleep. Adding too little would allow the coals to cool too much, reducing the heat output. The correct approach was to add a single small piece, perhaps the size of a forearm, every few hours. The wood would catch on the existing coals, burn down, and add to the bed without creating flames. The person responsible for this task had to wake several times during the night. They would rise quietly, move to the fire pit, and place the new piece of wood. Then they would return to their robes and go back to sleep. This pattern repeated until morning. In some families, this responsibility rotated. In others, it was the task of a specific person, often an elder or the head of the household. The decision depended on the family structure and the abilities of its members. The sound of the night fire was subtle. There was no crackling of flames, no snapping of burning wood. Instead, there was a faint hiss as moisture in a new piece of fuel turned to steam, or a soft crumble as a coal broke apart. These sounds were so quiet that they blended into the background, becoming part of the stillness. The light from the coals was dim. It was not enough to see clearly by, but it was enough to navigate the interior of the teepee if you needed to. The glow was a deep red, casting soft shadows on the walls. It created an atmosphere of warmth and enclosure, a reminder that the fire was still alive. The night fire also produced a smell. It was the smell of wood smoke, but muted. There was no sharp tang of burning sap, no acrid edge of fresh flames. It was a warm, earthy scent that settled into the hides and the hair and the clothing of everyone inside. It was the smell of safety. Outside, the temperature continued to drop. The coldest part of the night came just before dawn, when the earth had radiated away all the heat it had absorbed during the day, and the sun had not yet begun to warm it again. This was the time when the fire mattered most. If the coal bed was well maintained, the interior of the teepee remained stable through this coldest hour. If it had been neglected, the temperature inside would begin to fall noticeably. People would wake, shivering, and someone would have to rebuild the fire, a task made more difficult by the cold and the drowsiness. The night fire was not dramatic. It did not roar or blaze. It simply persisted, hour after hour, providing the steady warmth that made sleep possible. It was a quiet, essential presence, as much a part of the teepee as the poles or the hides. Inside the teepee, space was limited. A structure with a diameter of 12 to 15 feet provided roughly 100 square feet of floor area. This had to accommodate 8 to 10 people, their bedding, stored food, tools and clothing. Organisation was essential. The interior was not arranged casually. Every area had a designated purpose and everyone knew their place. This organisation was not written down. It was taught through observation and reinforced through daily practice. The rear of the teepee, opposite the door, was the place of honour. This was the west end, the direction the door faced away from. In this space sat the head of the family or any distinguished guest. This position was sheltered from drafts farthest from the door and received the most reflected heat from the ozone overhead. The teepee was divided by an invisible line running from the door to the rear. Men generally sat on the north side of this line. Women sat on the south side. This division was not rigid. People moved as needed for tasks, but it provided a basic order that prevented crowding and confusion. Upon entering the teepee, a person would move in a specific direction based on gender. Men moved to the right, proceeding clockwise around the fire to reach the north side. Women moved to the left, proceeding counterclockwise to the south side. This pattern meant that people did not cross paths unnecessarily in the small space. Children were more flexible in their positioning, but they generally stayed on the side appropriate to their gender once they were old enough to understand the arrangement. Very young children stayed close to their mothers. The space immediately around the fire pit was communal. It belonged to no one specifically and was used by everyone. This was where cooking happened, where people gathered to talk, and where tasks requiring good light were performed during the day. Seating around the fire followed additional rules. It was considered extremely rude to pass between a seated person and the fire. Doing so blocked their warmth and light. If you needed to cross the teepee, you walked behind the seated people, near the walls, not through the centre. Each person had a designated sleeping spot. These spots were arranged around the perimeter of the teepee, with heads toward the walls and feet toward the fire. This arrangement maximised the use of space and ensured that everyone benefited from the fire's heat. The sleeping areas were not all equal. The spots at the rear, near the place of honour, were the warmest and most protected. These were typically assigned to elders or to small children who were most vulnerable to cold. The spots near the door were the coldest, and were usually occupied by young adults who could tolerate less comfortable conditions. Storage was organised vertically. The teepee's conical shape meant that the walls sloped inward. This created space between the outer edge of the floor and the walls where items could be stacked. Parfleche bags, rawhide containers used for storing food and clothing, were placed in these areas. They were stacked carefully to make use of every inch of available space. Weapons and tools were kept near their owners. A man's bow, arrows and knife would be within arm's reach of his sleeping spot. A woman's sewing kit, her hide scrapers, and her cooking tools would be near hers. This ensured that in an emergency people could access what they needed quickly. The organisation of the teepee reflected the social structure of the family. The Tipi itself was the property of the woman who built it. This was not a symbolic ownership. It was a legal reality recognised by the entire community. If a marriage ended, the man left. The woman, her children, and the tipi remained. Women were responsible for the construction, maintenance, and interior arrangement of the lodge. They decided where things were stored, how the space was divided, and when repairs were needed. This gave them significant authority within the domestic sphere. Men were responsible for providing the poles, hunting for food, and defending the family. But inside the tipi, they followed the organisational system established by the women. This was not a matter of subservience. It was practical. The women knew the structure intimately because they had built it. Guests were treated with specific protocols. When a visitor entered, they did not simply sit wherever they wanted. They waited to be invited to sit, and they were directed to an appropriate spot based on their relationship to the family and their status in the community. A distinguished visitor would be offered the place of honour at the rear. They would be served food first and given the best robes if they were staying overnight. This hospitality was a matter of honour and was extended even when resources were scarce. The etiquette of the tipi extended to behaviour as well as positioning. Speaking loudly was discouraged. The close quarters meant that loud voices were jarring and disruptive. Conversations were conducted in normal or even quiet tones. Movement inside the tipi was deliberate and careful. People were conscious of not bumping into others, not stepping on belongings, and not disturbing those who were resting or working. This carefulness was necessary in a space where a careless gesture could knock over a water container or scatter hot coals from the fire. Silence was valued, especially at night. Once people began to settle for sleep, talking ceased. The only sounds were the breathing of the occupants, the occasional shift of a body under the robes, and the faint hiss of the fire. This quiet was essential for rest. The order of the circle was maintained through collective understanding. There were no written rules, no posted guidelines. Everyone simply knew what was expected. This knowledge was absorbed from childhood, reinforced by correction when necessary, and passed on to the next generation. In a larger camp, the same principles applied at the community level. The tipis were arranged in a circle, with each family's position determined by tradition and status. The opening of each tipi faced east, and the circle as a whole created a protected central space. This was the sacred hoop, a physical manifestation of the community's unity and order. Inside the individual tipi, the circle was smaller but no less important. It was the structure within which a family survived the winter. Without order, there would be conflict. Without conflict resolution, there would be tension. And tension, in a confined space during months of isolation, could destroy a family as surely as cold or hunger. The order of the circle was not oppressive, it was liberating. It removed uncertainty. Everyone knew where they belonged, what was expected of them, and how to move through the space without causing problems. This clarity allowed people to focus on survival, rather than on navigating social ambiguity. The ground inside the tipi was frozen. Even with a fire burning constantly, the earth beneath the structure remained hard and cold. Sleeping directly on this surface was not possible. The cold would conduct through any amount of clothing or hide, drawing heat from the body until hypothermia set in. The solution was to create a barrier between the body and the ground. This barrier came in layers, each serving a specific purpose. The first layer was plant material. Dried grasses were gathered in the autumn and stored for winter use. These grasses were spread across the sleeping areas, creating a mat several inches thick. The grasses were not simply piled randomly. They were arranged so that the stems all pointed in the same direction, creating a smooth surface. Sage was also used. The leaves and stems of sagebrush, when dried, were aromatic and had a slight antimicrobial quality. Sleeping on a sage was not only more comfortable, but also helped keep the bedding fresher over the months of continuous use. The dried plant material served multiple functions. It provided a soft base that was more comfortable than bare earth. It also trapped air between the stems and leaves, creating a layer of insulation. Air is a poor conductor of heat, so this trapped air prevented body heat from flowing into the frozen ground below. On top of the plant layer, hides were laid flat. These were buffalo hides that had been tanned but were no longer suitable for other uses. They might be old tipi covers that had worn too thin, or they might be hides that had been damaged during tanning. Whatever their origin, they were still functional as ground insulation. The hides were arranged to cover the entire sleeping area. They overlapped slightly at the edges to prevent gaps where cold air could seep through. The hides added another layer of insulation and provided a more durable surface than the plant material alone. Above these layers came the willow bed. This was a raised platform made from willow rods. The rods were cut to length, peeled of their bark, and lashed together side by side using sinew or rawhide. The result was a flexible mat that could be rolled up for transport or laid flat for sleeping. The willow bed was supported by a simple frame. 2 or 3 poles were placed parallel to each other on the ground, and the willow mat was laid across them. This elevated the sleeping surface by several inches. The elevation was critical. It allowed air to circulate beneath the bed, preventing moisture from accumulating. Moisture was a constant problem in winter. Human bodies release moisture through breath and perspiration. In a sealed teepee, this moisture had to go somewhere. Some of it escaped through the ventilation system, but some condensed on cold surfaces. If the bedding was in direct contact with the ground, condensation would freeze beneath it, creating a layer of ice. The raised bed prevented this. The willow rods were slightly flexible, which made the bed more comfortable than a rigid surface. They conformed to the body's shape to a small degree, reducing pressure points. This was important for people who spent many hours lying down during the long winter nights. During the day, the willow bed could be propped up against the wall of the teepee, creating a backrest. People would sit on the ground with their backs against the angled bed, using it as a chair. This dual function made efficient use of the limited space. On top of the willow bed, buffalo robes were placed. A buffalo robe is a hide that has been tanned, with the hair left on. The hair side could face either up or down, depending on the purpose. For a mattress, the hair side often faced up, providing a soft surface to lie on. For a blanket, the hair side faced inward, trapping heat against the body. The quality of the buffalo robe determined its effectiveness as insulation. The best robes came from buffalo killed in late fall or early winter, when the animals had grown their thick winter coats. The hair on these robes was dense and long, sometimes several inches in depth. Buffalo hair is uniquely suited for insulation. Each hair is hollow, which means it contains a column of trapped air. Air is an excellent insulator, so the hollow structure significantly increases the robe's ability to retain heat. Additionally, buffalo have a thick undercoat of fine woolly hair beneath the longer guard hairs. This undercoat provides a second layer of insulation. A single buffalo robe could weigh 20 pounds or more. The weight was an advantage. It pressed down on the body, eliminating air gaps where heat could escape. At the same time, the thickness of the fur created a substantial barrier against the cold air in the teepee. Most people slept under multiple robes. One robe served as a mattress, laid hair side up on the willow bed. A second robe was used as a blanket wrapped around the body with the hair side facing in. In the coldest weather, a third robe might be added on top, providing an additional layer. The robes were large enough to wrap completely around a person. The edges overlapped, sealing in warmth. A person cocooned in buffalo robes was surrounded by fur on all sides, beneath, above, and around. This created a micro-environment where body heat was trapped and retained. The temperature inside this cocoon could be significantly warmer than the surrounding air. Even if the interior of the teepee dropped to near freezing, the space inside the robes could remain at a comfortable 60 or 70 degrees. This differential was the result of the insulating properties of the fur and the heat generated by the human body. An adult human at rest produces roughly 100 watts of heat. This is not a large amount, but in a well-insulated space it is sufficient. The buffalo robes captured that heat and prevented it from dissipating into the cold air. Over the course of a night, the accumulated warmth was enough to keep the body at a safe temperature. Children often slept together, sharing robes. This had practical advantages. Multiple bodies in close proximity generated more heat. The shared warmth made it possible to stay comfortable with fewer robes, which was important in families that did not have an abundance of hides. Shared sleeping also had social benefits. It reinforced bonds between siblings and created a sense of security. In the darkness of a winter night, with the wind howling outside and the temperature plummeting, The presence of another person was reassuring. The robes required maintenance. Over time, they would accumulate dirt, grease, and the smell of smoke. Periodically, they needed to be aired out. On milder winter days, when the sun was shining and the temperature rose above freezing, robes would be taken outside and draped over poles or bushes. The sun and fresh air would help remove odours and moisture. The robes also needed to be checked for damage. Moths and other insects could infest stored hides, eating holes in the leather or damaging the hair. Small holes could be repaired by sewing patches over them. Larger damage might require the robe to be repurposed, perhaps cut into smaller pieces for clothing or other uses. Buffalo robes were valuable. A single robe represented a significant investment of labour. The hunt, the skinning, the tanning, the transport. Families took care of their robes because replacing them was not always possible. Buffalo were not always available, and the work required to process a hide was substantial. The combination of dried grass, hides, willow beds, and buffalo robes created a sleeping system that was both effective and portable. When the camp moved, the robes could be rolled up and carried. The willow beds could be dismantled and bundled. The system went where the people went, providing the same level of comfort and warmth regardless of location. Sleeping in a winter tipi was not the same as sleeping in a modern heated home. The air was cold, breath condensed into visible clouds. Noses and ears exposed above the robes would feel the chill, but the body, wrapped in layers of insulation, remained warm. It was a different kind of comfort, but it was comfort nonetheless. The tipi was not a neutral structure. It belonged to the woman. This was not a metaphor or a courtesy. It was a legal and social reality. A woman who built a tipi owned it. She owned the poles, the cover, the liner, and everything inside except the personal possessions of other family members. If she decided to leave her husband, she kept the tipi. If her husband left, the tipi remained hers. This ownership was recognised by the entire community and was not subject to dispute. The construction of the tipi was women's work. From the initial cutting and preparation of the hides to the final assembly of the cover, every step was performed by women. Men might assist with tasks that required strength, such as raising the heavy cover onto the frame, but the knowledge and skill belonged to the women. The process of building a tipi began years before the structure was actually assembled. It began with the tanning of hides. A woman would collect buffalo hides from successful hunts, usually over several years, until she had enough to construct a cover. 8 to 20 hides were needed, depending on the size of the tipi. Tanning a single hide could take a week. Tanning 15 hides was months of work. This work was often done communally, with women helping each other. A young woman preparing her first tipi would be assisted by her mother, aunts, and other experienced women. They would teach her the techniques and help her complete the labour. Once the hides were tanned, they had to be cut and sewn. The pattern for the cover was not written down. It existed in the memory and hands of the women who had done this work before. An experienced woman could look at a pile of hides and know how to cut them so that they would fit together into a cone that would wrap around a frame of a specific size. The cutting was done with knives made from bone, stone, or later metal. The edges had to be straight and smooth. Poor cutting would result in seams that did not align, creating gaps in the cover. The sewing was done with sinew. Sinew is the tendon from the leg or back of a buffalo or deer. When dried, it can be split into thin strands that are incredibly strong. The sinew was threaded through holes punched in the hides using a bone awl. Each stitch had to be tight and evenly spaced. Loose stitches would fail, under the stress of wind. The entire process of assembling a tipi cover could take weeks, and this was only the cover. The liner, the ozan, the door flap, and the smoke flaps all had to be made separately. Each required additional hides and more sewing. The woman who completed this work was demonstrating her skill and her commitment to her family's survival. A well-made tipi was a source of pride. It was evidence of her industry, her knowledge, and her ability to provide shelter. The maintenance of the tipi was also the woman's responsibility. When a seam began to loosen, she repaired it. When a section of the cover wore thin, she patched it, or replaced it. When the liner needed adjustment, she made the changes. This constant maintenance was essential. A tipi that was not cared for would deteriorate quickly. Seams would split in the wind, hides would rot from moisture. The structure would become less effective and eventually it would fail. Women also controlled the interior, organisation. They decided where food was stored, where tools were kept, and how the sleeping areas were arranged. They managed the daily tasks of cooking, preparing water, and maintaining the fire during the day. This control gave women significant authority within the household. While men made decisions about hunting and warfare, women made decisions about the home. And since the home was where the family spent most of the winter, those decisions were critically important. The ownership of the tipi also provided women with economic independence. A woman who owned a tipi could leave a bad marriage and take her children with her. She would have shelter and the means to survive. This was not a theoretical possibility. It happened. Women did leave marriages, and their ownership of the tipi made it possible. In some tribes, women could also trade or give away their tipi. If a woman died and had no daughters to inherit the structure, it might be given to a sister, a niece, or another female relative. Occasionally, a tipi might be traded for horses or other valuable goods. The skills required to build and maintain a tipi were taught from childhood. Girls learned by watching their mothers and grandmothers. They started with small tasks, helping to stretch a hide, holding pieces together while someone else sewed, fetching tools. As they grew older, they took on more complex work. By the time a girl reached adulthood, she was expected to know how to construct a tipi on her own. This knowledge was not optional. A woman who could not build or maintain a tipi was at a significant disadvantage. She would be dependent on others for shelter, and in a culture where self-sufficiency was highly valued, this dependence was a mark against her. The tipi was also a symbol of a woman's status. A large, well-maintained tipi indicated a successful family. It showed that the woman had the skills and resources to create quality shelter. It was a visible marker of her competence. Some women owned more than one tipi. A wealthy or high-status family might have a separate tipi for guests or for storing food and equipment. These additional structures were also owned by the woman, adding to her wealth and influence. The woman's ownership of the tipi was not challenged by the men. It was simply how things were. Men understood that the tipi belonged to the woman because she had made it, she maintained it, and she controlled the domestic space. This division of labour and property was efficient and practical. The tipi was the woman's lodge. It was her creation, her responsibility, and her domain. This arrangement ensured that families had shelter, that the knowledge of construction was preserved, and that women had a measure of autonomy and security in a world where survival depended on cooperation and clear roles. Survival through winter required food, not small amounts, but massive quantities. A single person needed roughly 3,000 calories per day just to maintain body heat and basic function in extreme cold. A family of 8 required 24,000 calories per day. Over a 4-month winter, that was nearly 3 million calories. The Plains tribes relied primarily on buffalo for this energy. Buffalo meat is dense in calories and protein. A single adult buffalo could provide hundreds of pounds of edible meat, along with fat, organs, and bone marrow, all of which were consumed. The autumn buffalo hunts were communal events. Entire bands would participate, driving herds toward cliffs or into corrals where the animals could be killed in large numbers. These hunts were carefully planned and executed. Failing to secure enough meat in the autumn meant starvation in the winter. Once the buffalo were killed, the work of processing began immediately. Meat spoils quickly, even in cold weather. It had to be preserved before bacteria could take hold. The primary preservation method was drying. Meat was sliced into thin strips and hung on wooden racks in the sun and wind. The process took several days. The strips had to be thin enough to dry completely, but thick enough to remain intact. If the meat was too thick, the interior would remain moist and would rot. If it was too thin, it would become brittle and lose nutritional value. Once dried, the meat was hard and dark. It resembled leather more than food, but it was stable. Dried meat could be stored for months or even years without refrigeration. It did not mould or spoil as long as it was kept dry. The dried meat was often pounded into a powder using stone tools. This powder was easier to transport and could be mixed with other ingredients to create pemmican. Pemmican was the ultimate survival food. It combined dried meat powder with rendered fat and dried berries. The fat was obtained by boiling buffalo bones and fat scraps, until the tallow separated and floated to the surface. This tallow was skimmed off and allowed to cool. The meat powder, fat and berries were mixed in. Specific proportions. The fat acted as a preservative and a binding agent, coating the meat particles and sealing them from oxygen. The berries, usually choke cherries or buffalo berries, provided flavour and essential vitamins, particularly vitamin C, which prevented scurvy. The mixture was packed into parfleche bags, large rawhide containers that were folded and sealed. Once sealed, pemmican could last for years. It did not need to be cooked. It could be eaten as is or dissolved in hot water to make a nutritious soup. Pemmican was energy-dense. A small piece could provide hundreds of calories. This made it ideal for winter, when fuel for cooking was limited and the body required constant energy to stay warm. Not all food was preserved as pemmican. Some meat was frozen. Cuts of buffalo were stored outside the tipi, where the winter cold kept them solid. Frozen meat did not spoil, though it had to be thawed and cooked before eating. Fat was especially valuable. Buffalo fat, also called tallow, was rendered and stored in cleaned intestines or bladders. Fat contains more than twice the calories per pound as protein or carbohydrates. In winter, when the body burns energy rapidly to maintain heat, fat is the most efficient fuel. Bone marrow was extracted by cracking the long bones of the buffalo and scooping out the soft interior. Marrow is rich in fat and nutrients. It could be eaten raw, cooked, or added to soups and stews. Organs were consumed as well. The liver, heart, kidneys, and tongue were all edible and nutritious. Some organs were eaten fresh, immediately after the hunt. Others were dried or frozen for later use. In addition to buffalo, the tribes gathered plant foods. The prairie turnip, also called tipsin, was a staple. This root vegetable grew wild on the plains. It was harvested in late summer, sliced and dried. Dried prairie turnip could be stored indefinitely, and was eaten throughout the winter, either raw or cooked. Wild rice was harvested by tribes, near the Great Lakes and the northern plains. The rice was gathered from shallow water, dried and stored. It was cooked by boiling or steaming and provided a source of carbohydrates and fibre. Berries were collected in large quantities during the summer. Choke cherries, buffalo berries and service berries were common. These were dried in the sun until they resembled raisins. Dried berries were eaten as snacks, added to pemmican, or boiled into a kind of porridge. Water was a constant need, but obtaining it in winter was difficult. Rivers and streams froze solid. Snow was abundant, but melting snow requires heat, and heat requires fuel. For every pound of snow melted, a certain amount of wood had to be burned. To conserve fuel, snow was melted in large batches. A container, usually made from buffalo hide or rawhide, was filled with snow and placed near the fire. As the snow melted, more snow was added till the container was full of water. This water was then transferred to storage containers. Water was stored in buffalo bladders. These were cleaned, dried, and then filled with liquid. The bladders were hung near the fire to keep the water from freezing. A single bladder could hold several gallons. Hydration was as important as food. Dehydration in winter is easy to overlook because people do not feel thirsty as readily in cold weather. But the dry air pulls moisture from the lungs with every breath. Without adequate water intake, the body becomes dehydrated, which impairs circulation and makes it harder to stay warm. Food preparation in winter was simple. Most meals were cooked over the fire in a single pot or heated on flat stones. Stews were common. Dried meat, prairie turnip and water were combined and boiled until the ingredients softened. The resulting broth was nutritious and warming. Cooking was done during the day, when the fire was larger and produced enough heat for the task. At night, when the fire was reduced to coals, no cooking was done. People ate what had been prepared earlier or consumed pemmican without heating it. The management of food supplies was critical. A family had to ration carefully to ensure that stores lasted through the entire winter. Running out of food before spring meant starvation. There were no stores to visit, no neighbours who could spare extra rations. Each family was responsible for its own survival. Women managed the food stores. They decided how much to use each day, how to distribute portions, and when to dip into emergency reserves. This required planning and discipline. It also required an accurate sense of time. Without calendars, women judged the passage of winter by the position of the sun, the condition of the snow, and their knowledge of how long winter typically lasted. Winter fuel, food and water, was the physical sustenance that kept bodies alive. Without it, no amount of warmth or shelter would matter. The tipi could be perfectly constructed, the fire expertly managed, and the bedding ideally arranged, but without calories and hydration, survival was impossible. Water is essential for life. A human can survive weeks without food, but only days without water. In winter on the plains, obtaining water was a constant challenge. The rivers and streams that flowed during the warmer months froze solid in winter. Ice could be several feet thick, extending from the surface down to the riverbed. Breaking through this ice was difficult and dangerous. The ice was hard enough to require tools, stone hammers or metal axes, and the effort of breaking through could exhaust a person quickly in the cold. Even after breaking through the ice, the water underneath was freezing. Containers had to be filled quickly and brought back to the teepee before they froze solid. Skin containers worked better than rigid ones because they could flex as the water turned to ice, preventing them from cracking. Some families cut blocks of ice from frozen rivers and transported them to the teepee. The ice was then melted slowly near the fire. This method was less labour-intensive than breaking through to liquid water, but it still required significant fuel to melt enough ice for a day's needs. Snow was more accessible than ice. It was everywhere, piled in drifts around the teepee and across the prairie. But snow is mostly air. It takes roughly 10 inches of snow to produce 1 inch of water. This meant that large volumes of snow had to be collected and melted to obtain even a small amount of water. The process of melting snow was inefficient. Snow placed directly in a container over the fire would melt at the bottom, but the heat would not conduct upward through the remaining snow. Instead, small amounts of snow were added gradually, allowing each layer to melt before adding more. Some families used a different method. They filled a hide bag with snow and suspended it near the fire, but not directly over it. The radiant heat from the fire would slowly melt the snow from the outside in. Melted water dripped into a container placed below the bag. This method was slower but did not require constant attention. The water produced from melted snow was clean, but it was also mineral poor. Drinking only snowmelt for extended periods could lead to a condition called water intoxication, where the body's electrolyte balance is disrupted. To prevent this, some water was taken from streams or rivers when possible, or minerals were added to the snowmelt by boiling it with certain plants, or by mixing it with broth from cooked meat. Water storage was another challenge. Containers had to be kept from freezing. Buffalo bladders were the most common storage vessel. These were flexible, durable, and could hold several gallons. They were hung near the fire where the heat kept the water liquid. The position of the bladder mattered. Too close to the fire and the bladder could be damaged by heat or sparks. Too far away and the water would freeze. The correct distance had to be judged carefully, and the bladder had to be repositioned if the fire grew or diminished. Some families buried containers of water in the snow outside the teepee. Snow is an insulator. If water was buried deep enough in a snowbank, it would freeze more slowly than if left exposed to the air. This was a temporary solution, useful for short-term storage but not reliable for days. Hydration was often overlooked in winter because people did not feel as thirsty. The cold suppressed the sensation of thirst, but the dry air meant that every breath released moisture. Exhaled air contains water vapour, and in winter, this vapour was visible as condensation. Over the course of a day, a person could lose significant amounts of water through breathing alone. Dehydration had serious consequences. It thickened the blood, making circulation more difficult. This reduced the body's ability to warm the extremities. Fingers and toes were the first to suffer. Dehydration also impaired judgment and coordination, increasing the risk of accidents. To ensure adequate hydration, water consumption was made a routine. Containers were passed around at regular intervals, and everyone was expected to drink. Children, who might not recognise their own thirst, were reminded and monitored. The effort required to obtain water meant that it was never wasted. Every drop was used. Water from cooking was saved and reused. Containers were cleaned by scraping rather than rinsing. Snow that melted on clothing or equipment was collected and added to the water supply. Ice had uses beyond providing water. Clear ice from rivers could be cut into blocks and used as temporary windows. A block of ice fitted into a small opening in the Tipi cover would allow light to enter while keeping out the wind. The ice would eventually melt, but it could last for days in freezing temperatures. Ice was also used for storage. Food that needed to be kept cold but not frozen could be packed in ice. The ice moderated the temperature, preventing the food from freezing solid while keeping it below the temperature at which bacteria would grow. The management of water in winter was a daily task. It required time, effort, and fuel. It was not dramatic or exciting, it was simply necessary. Without water, the body would shut down within days. With water, life could continue through the long frozen months. Winter days on the plains were short. In December and January, the sun rose late and set early. Daylight lasted only 8 or 9 hours. Darkness stretched for 15 hours or more. During those long nights, and during the blizzards that could last for days, people needed more than warmth and food. They needed occupation for the mind. Boredom in confinement could be as dangerous as cold or hunger. It led to irritability, conflict, and despair. The tribes had developed ways to fill the dark hours. Some were practical, tasks that needed to be done regardless of the weather. Others were for entertainment and education. Together, they created a rhythm that made the confinement bearable. Games were central to winter life. These were not casual pastimes. They were structured activities that served multiple purposes. They maintained physical skills, taught strategy and patience, and provided a focus that prevented the mind from dwelling on the cold and darkness outside. The most prominent winter game was Snow Snake. This was played outdoors on days when the weather permitted. A track was prepared by dragging a log through deep snow to create a long, straight trough. The snow in the trough was packed down and sometimes iced with water to create a fast, smooth surface. The track could extend for half a mile or more. The snakes themselves were wooden poles typically 6 to 10 feet long. They were made from hardwood, maple, hickory, or ash when available. The poles were carved and shaped with care. The front end was slightly upturned, like the head of a snake. The shaft was rounded and polished until it was completely smooth. Achieving this smoothness required hours of work. The wood was rubbed with steel wool or fine sand, then polished with tallow or other fats. The goal was to eliminate every trace of roughness. Even a small splinter or bump would create drag and slow the snake. Players hurled the snakes down the track using an overhand or underhand motion. The technique mattered. Too much force, and the snake would bounce out of the trough. Too little, and it would lose momentum quickly. The best players developed a smooth, controlled release that sent the snake gliding for hundreds of yards. Distance was the measure of success. The snake that travelled farthest won. Competitions could involve individuals or teams. Wagers were sometimes placed on the outcomes. The game was taken seriously, but it was also a source of joy. After weeks of confinement, the opportunity to go outside and engage in a physical contest lifted spirits across the entire camp. Snow Snake was not just for adults. Boys learned the game from an early age. They carved their own snakes, smaller and lighter than the adult versions, and practiced on shorter tracks. The game taught hand-eye coordination, patience in crafting the equipment, and the value of practice and refinement. Inside the teepee, other games were played. The hand game, also called the stick game, was popular. This was a guessing game played with small objects, usually pieces of bone or wood, one marked and one unmarked. A player would hold the objects behind their back, then bring their closed fists forward. The opponent had to guess which hand held the marked object. The game sounds simple, but it involved psychology and observation. Players watched for tells, small movements or expressions that might reveal where the marked object was hidden. Good players developed poker faces and misdirection techniques. The game could go on for hours, with players taking turns hiding and guessing. Gambling often accompanied the hand. Game. Players wagered small items, beads, pieces of food, or markers that represented larger goods. The stakes were rarely high enough to cause hardship, but they were sufficient to make the game interesting. Dice games were also played. Dice were made from bone or wood and carved with different markings on each face. The dice were thrown onto a hide or a flat board, and the combination of markings determined the score. Different tribes had different rules and scoring systems, but the basic concept was universal. Children had their own games. Bone sliders were popular. These were buffalo ribs that had been boiled, cleaned and polished until they were smooth. They were thrown onto ice or hard-packed snow, where they would slide for long distances. Children competed to see whose slider would go farthest, or could knock another slider out of a marked area. Miniature bows and arrows were used for target practice inside the tipi when the weather was too severe to go outside. The arrows were tipped with blunt ends to prevent injury. Targets were set up. Bundles of grass, pieces of hide with markings, or small hoops. Children practiced their aim, developing skills that would be essential for hunting later in life. Storytelling was perhaps the most important entertainment. Winter was the traditional season for stories. The long nights provided time, and the gathered family provided an audience. Elders were the primary storytellers, though anyone with a good tale might be invited to share. The stories served multiple functions. Some were purely for entertainment, tales of tricksters like Coyote or Raven, who used cunning and humour to outwit others. These stories were funny and engaging, and they kept children's attention even during the longest nights. Other stories were educational. They taught history, explaining how the people came to live on the plains, how they acquired horses, or how they survived past disasters. These stories preserved collective memory in a culture without written records. Still other stories were warnings, tales of spirits that lured children away from camp, of the dangers of disobedience, or of the consequences of laziness. These stories taught survival skills disguised as myth. A child who heard about the ice spirits tapping on the tipi walls would understand, without being told directly, that leaving the warmth of the lodge in winter could be fatal. The ice spirits were a common motif. They were described as the voices in the wind, calling children's names, inviting them to come outside and play. The stories made it clear that anyone who followed these voices would freeze to death within minutes. The myth was a teaching tool, making a concrete danger memorable through narrative. Storytelling also reinforced cultural values. Stories about generosity, bravery, humility, and respect were repeated year after year. Children absorbed these values through the tales, learning what their community honoured and what it condemned. The winter counts were sometimes shared during these storytelling sessions. The keeper of the winter count would bring out the hide on which the pictographs were painted. Each symbol represented a year, and the keeper would recount the event that defined that year. This was living history, a chronicle of the people's journey through time. Listeners would sometimes add their own memories, filling in details or correcting errors. The winter count was not the property of a single person. It was a communal document, maintained by the keeper but belonging to everyone. Music was another form of entertainment. Drums were played, and songs were sung. Some songs were ceremonial, tied to specific rituals or seasons. Others were social songs, sung for enjoyment. The rhythm of the drum and the repetition of the verses created a meditative atmosphere that was calming and unifying. Flutes were also played. These were carved from wood or bone and produced soft melodic notes. Flute music was often associated with courtship, but it was also played simply for pleasure. The sound of a flute in the darkness, accompanied by the glow of the fire, created a moment of beauty in the midst of the harsh season. Crafts occupied much of the indoor time. Women worked on quillwork, sewing intricate designs onto moccasins, shirts and bags. Quillwork required patience and precision. Porcupine quills were sorted by size, softened in the mouth, and then flattened. They were dyed using plant and mineral pigments, red from berries, yellow from lichens, black from charcoal. The quills were sewn onto leather using specific patterns. Geometric designs were common: diamonds, triangles, zigzags. Each design had meaning, though the meanings varied by tribe and family. A woman who excelled at quillwork gained respect and status. Her work was visible evidence of her skill and dedication. Men worked on tools and weapons. Bows were carved from hardwood, shaped carefully to ensure even flecks along the limbs. The wood was heated over the fire and bent into the desired curve, then left to cool and set. Bow-making was a slow process, sometimes taking weeks to complete a single weapon. Arrows were fletched with bird feathers. The feathers had to be matched for weight and shape to ensure the arrow flew straight. They were attached to the shaft using sinew and hide glue. The process required steady hands and attention to detail. Stone tools were knapped, shaped by carefully striking a piece of flint or obsidian with another stone or a piece of antler. Each strike removed a small flake, gradually shaping the stone into a knife blade, scraper, or arrowhead. Knapping was skilled work. A poor strike could shatter the stone and waste valuable material. These activities filled the hours. They kept hands busy and minds occupied. They reinforced the skills that would be needed when spring came and the tribe returned to a mobile existence. And they created a sense of normalcy, a routine that made the winter feel less like imprisonment and more like a different phase of life. In the darkness of the winter teepee, stories were more than entertainment. They were survival tools, cultural archives, and maps of meaning. The elders were the keepers of these stories. They had heard them from their own grandparents, and those grandparents had heard them from theirs. Some stories were hundreds of years old, passed down through countless retellings. Others were more recent, accounts of events within living memory. The stories were not written. They existed only in memory and voice. This meant they had to be memorable. They used repetition, rhythm, and vivid imagery. They had clear structures, beginnings, middles, and ends. They featured characters who were larger than life, whose actions were easy to recall. Coyote was a central figure in many plain stories. Coyote was a trickster, clever but often foolish. He would devise elaborate schemes to get what he wanted: food, power, mate. But his plans would backfire, often in humorous ways. Coyote stories were funny, but they also taught lessons about the consequences of greed, deception, and arrogance. In one common tale, Coyote sees ducks swimming on a lake and wants to catch them. He pretends to be dead, lying still on the shore. The ducks, curious, come closer. Coyote suddenly springs up and grabs one, but the others fly away. Coyote has gained a meal, but he has also taught the ducks to be wary. The next time he tries the trick, they do not fall for it. The story is simple, but it contains multiple lessons. It shows that cleverness can succeed, but only once. It demonstrates that animals learn from experience, and it suggests that taking too much, being greedy, leads to less in the long run. Other stories featured spirits and supernatural beings. These were often cautionary tales. A young man who disrespects his elders might encounter a spirit that teaches him humility through hardship. A girl who wanders away from camp might be taken by the little people, mysterious beings who live in the hills and do not return those they capture. These stories were particularly important for children. They taught boundaries and behaviours without direct confrontation. A parent did not need to constantly remind a child not to wander off. The stories did that work, creating a narrative framework that made the danger memorable and real. The ice spirits have already been mentioned, but they are worth exploring further. They were described as voices or figures that appeared on the coldest nights. They would call to children, using the child's name, saying that it was safe to come outside, that there was something wonderful to see. The stories made clear that these voices were death itself, disguised as invitation. A child who followed would be found the next morning, frozen a short distance from the teepee. The stories sometimes described the ice spirits as having faces that looked like family, members or friends, making them even more seductive and dangerous. These tales were not meant to terrify, they were meant to inform. Winter on the plains was deadly. Hypothermia could kill in minutes. Children needed to understand this, but explaining the mechanics of heat loss and tissue damage would not be effective. A story about malevolent spirits tapping on the walls was memorable. It stuck in the mind. It created an emotional association, fear, that reinforced the practical lesson. Stay inside. Historical stories preserved the collective memory of the tribe. These were accounts of migrations, battles, alliances, and significant events. They explained how the people came to live where they did, how they acquired horses, and how they survived epidemics or famines. One common historical narrative involved the acquisition of horses. Before horses, the plains tribes lived differently. They hunted on foot, using dogs to pull travois loaded with belongings. The arrival of horses, which escaped from Spanish settlements in the south and spread northward, transformed plains life. Horses allowed tribes to hunt buffalo more effectively, to travel greater distances, and to carry more goods. The stories about this transformation were specific. They named individuals who first captured horses, described how the animals were tamed, and recounted the initial fear and awe they inspired. These stories anchored the people to their history, showing them how their way of life had evolved. Creation stories explained the origin of the world and the place of humans within it. These varied by tribe, but common themes included the emergence of people from beneath the earth, the role of animals in creating the land, and the establishment of the sacred relationship between humans and the buffalo. The Lakota told of White Buffalo Calf Woman, a sacred figure who brought the people the pipe and taught them how to pray. This story was foundational. It explained the spiritual significance of the buffalo, the importance of ritual, and the proper relationship between humans and the divine. These creation stories were not told casually. They were reserved for specific occasions, often during ceremonies or at times when the community needed to be reminded of its identity and values. They were treated with reverence, and listeners were expected to pay close attention. Moral stories taught ethics and proper behaviour. A common tale involved a man who refused to share his meat with the hungry. As punishment, he was transformed into a creature that could never eat enough, condemned to eternal hunger. The message was clear. Selfishness harms both the individual and the community. Another story told of a woman who complained constantly about the hardships of life. She was given a vision of the future, where she saw that her complaints had driven away her family and left her alone. The vision showed her that her attitude, not her circumstances, was the source of her unhappiness. The story taught gratitude and resilience. The stories were not static. Different tellers emphasized different elements. A grandmother might focus on the emotional aspects of a tale, while a grandfather might emphasize the practical lessons. Over time, stories evolved, but their core remained the same. Storytelling was interactive. Listeners responded with expressions of agreement, surprise, or amusement. Children asked questions which were answered within the narrative framework. This interaction made the stories a communal experience, not a monologue. The winter nights were long enough that multiple stories could be told in a single evening. The rhythm of storytelling, one tale leading to another with pauses for discussion or reflection, created a sense of time passing without dragging. Hours would go by, and then it was time to sleep. Stories were the threads that held the community together. They preserved knowledge, taught values, and provided a shared cultural vocabulary. In a world without books, without schools, without written records, stories were the library, the classroom, and the historical archive. Time, for the Plains tribes, was not measured in days or months as Europeans measured it. It was measured in winters. A person's age was counted by the number of winters they had lived. A historical event was placed by recalling which winter it occurred. The winter count was the physical record of this calendar. It was a pictorial chronicle, usually painted on a buffalo hide, though later versions used paper or cloth. Each winter was represented by a single glyph, a simple drawing that symbolized the most significant event of that year. The winter count was maintained by a keeper, usually an elder with a strong memory and a reputation for honesty. The keeper's role was to remember the stories associated with each glyph and to add a new glyph at the end of each year. The process of choosing the glyph was communal. As winter approached its end, the elders of the band would gather. They would discuss the events of the past year, births, deaths, hunts, battles, natural phenomena. They would debate which event was most significant, most representative of the year as a whole. This was not a quick decision. Different people had different perspectives. An elder who had lost a family member might feel that death was the defining event. A young warrior who had distinguished himself in battle might argue for that event. A woman who had witnessed a miraculous hunt might nominate that. Eventually, consensus was reached. The chosen event was described to the keeper, who would create a glyph to represent it. The glyph had to be simple enough to fit in a small space but distinctive enough to be remembered. It had to capture the essence of the event in a single image. The keeper would paint the glyph on the hide, usually in a spiral pattern starting from the centre and moving outward. Each glyph was accompanied by a brief oral narrative that the keeper memorized. This narrative provided the details that the image alone could not convey. The winter count served multiple purposes. It was a historical record, a chronological marker, and a communal memory device. When elders wanted to recall when a particular event had occurred, they would consult the winter count. The keeper would point to the relevant glyph and recount the story. Some winter counts spanned centuries. The Batiste Good Winter Count, maintained by the Sikang Lakota, covered 677 years, from 1230 to 1907. This was not the work of a single keeper, but of a succession of keepers, each inheriting the hide and the responsibility from their predecessor. The glyphs recorded a wide range of events. Natural phenomena were common. The Leonid meteor storm of 1833 was recorded in nearly every winter count from the plains. The glyph typically showed stars falling around a crescent moon or a tipi. This event, visible across the continent, became a chronological anchor. Historians could synchronize different winter counts by identifying the 1833 glyph. Climate events were also recorded. A year of exceptionally deep snow might be symbolized by a tipi buried up to its smoke hole. A drought might be shown as withered plants or dry riverbeds. These records provide valuable information to modern scientists studying historical climate patterns. Human events filled many glyphs. The first appearance of white soldiers, the outbreak of smallpox, the signing of treaties, and major battles were all documented. A glyph might show a soldier with a specific uniform detail, or it might depict the characteristic rash of smallpox on a human figure. Some glyphs were more personal. A year when many horses were stolen might show a string of horses being led away. A year of abundant buffalo might depict a large herd. A winter when a respected elder died might show that person's distinctive possession or attribute. The winter count was not a private document. It belonged to the entire community. On winter nights, the keeper would sometimes bring out the hide and recount the history it contained. This was both education and entertainment. Younger people learned the history of their nation. Older people were reminded of events they had lived through, and they sometimes added details or corrections to the keeper's narrative. The act of maintaining the winter count reinforced the community's sense of continuity. It showed that the present was connected to the past and that the events of today would be part of the record for future generations. This created a sense of responsibility. People wanted to be associated with honourable events, not shameful ones. The winter count also served a practical purpose. It helped resolve disputes about when things had happened. If two people disagreed about whether a particular hunt occurred before or after a certain battle, they could consult the winter count. The keeper's record was considered authoritative. Not every tribe maintained a winter count in exactly the same way. Some tribes used notched sticks, where each notch represented a year, and the keeper remembered the associated story. Others used strings of beads or shells, with different colours or sizes representing different types of events. But the principle was the same. Time was measured in winters, and each winter was defined by a single event. This was a fundamentally different approach to history than the linear, date-driven chronology of European cultures. It was more flexible, more communal, and more focused on narrative than on precision. The winter counts that survive today are invaluable historical documents. They provide an indigenous perspective on events that European and American records also describe, but from a different viewpoint. They record events that outside observers never knew about, and they demonstrate the sophistication of Plains cultures in preserving and transmitting knowledge across generations without written language. Winter was the season for making things. The long hours of confinement provided time to work on projects that could not be completed during the busy months of spring, summer, and autumn. Quillwork was among the most important of these winter crafts. This was intricate decorative work done almost exclusively by women. It involved sewing dyed porcupine quills onto leather to create geometric patterns. Porcupine quills were harvested during the warmer months. Porcupines were not hunted specifically for their quills, but when one was encountered and killed for meat, the quills were carefully collected. A single porcupine could provide several hundred quills of varying lengths. The quills were sorted by size. Long quills from the animal's back and tail were used for larger projects. Shorter quills, from the sides and belly, were used for finer details. Each quill was hollow, lightweight, and naturally white or cream-coloured. To make quills pliable, enough to work with, they had to be softened. This was done by placing them in the mouth. Saliva softened the quills and made them flexible. Women would hold several quills between their lips, taking them out one at a time as needed. The quills were also flattened. A naturally round quill was difficult to sew onto leather. By pressing the quill between the teeth or against a hard surface, it could be flattened into a ribbon-like shape. This made it easier to attach and created a smoother surface. Dyeing the quills was a separate process, usually done in the autumn. Natural pigments were used. Red came from berries or from iron-rich clay. Yellow came from certain lichens or from the inner bark of trees. Black came from charcoal or from walnut hulls. Blue was more difficult to achieve and was often obtained through trade. The quills were boiled in water with the pigment until they absorbed the colour. The intensity of the colour depended on how long the quills were boiled and how much pigment was used. After dyeing, the quills were dried and stored until needed. Quillwork required a specific technique. The quill was threaded through a small hole punched in the leather using a bone awl. The quill was then folded over and sewn down, creating a small stitch. The process was repeated, with each quill overlapping the previous one slightly, until a line or shape was completed. The patterns were geometric. Triangles, diamonds, zigzags, and parallel lines were common. These designs were not random. They often had symbolic meanings, representing natural elements like mountains, rivers, or lightning. A pattern might also signify a family's clan or a woman's personal history. Quillwork was time-consuming. A pair of moccasins could take days to complete. A shirt or a bag might require weeks. The work demanded patience, steady hands, and good eyesight. It was usually done during the day, when light from the smoke hole or from the fire was strongest. Women who excelled at quillwork gained prestige. Their work was admired and sought after. A beautifully decorated item was not just functional, it was a work of art. It demonstrated the maker's skill and dedication. Such items were sometimes given as gifts to mark important occasions or to honour respected individuals. Men during the same winter months worked on tools and weapons. Bow-making was a primary task. A good bow required careful selection of wood and precise shaping. The best bowwood was ash, though hawthorn and other hardwoods were also used. The wood had to be straight-grained and free of knots. A section of wood was cut to length, roughly 4 to 5 feet for an adult bow, and then shaped. The shaping was done by scraping and carving. The bow had to be thicker in the middle, where the hand gripped it, and thinner toward the ends. This distribution of mass allowed the bow to flex evenly when drawn. If the bow was too thick at the ends, it would not bend properly. If it was too thin, it would snap. Once the basic shape was achieved, the bow was heated over the fire. The heat made the wood pliable. While warm, the bow was bent into the desired curve and held in position until it cooled. This process was repeated several times to set the curve permanently. The finished bow was sanded smooth and sometimes treated with grease or oil to protect it from moisture. A string made from sinew or plant fibre was attached to both ends. The tension of the string held the bow in its curved shape. Arrows required equal care. The shafts were made from straight shoots, often from willow or dogwood. The shoots were cut, peeled, and straightened by heating them over the fire and bending out any curves. Fletching, attaching feathers to the back of the arrow, was essential for accuracy. The feathers caused the arrow to spin in flight, stabilizing it. 3 feathers were typically used, spaced evenly around the shaft. They were attached with sinew and glue made from boiled hide. The arrowhead could be made from stone, bone, or metal. Stone arrowheads were knapped from flint or obsidian. The process involved striking the stone at precise angles to remove flakes and create sharp edges. A well-made stone arrowhead could pierce buffalo hide. Metal arrowheads, once they became available through trade, were easier to produce. A piece of metal was hammered flat, cut into a triangular shape, and sharpened. Metal points were more durable than stone, but they were also heavier, which affected the arrow's flight. Each arrow was unique. A hunter could identify his own arrows by their fletching pattern, the colour of the feathers, or marks carved into the shaft. This was important when multiple hunters were involved in a kill. The arrows told who had made the successful shot. Other tools were also maintained or created during winter. Scrapers for processing hides were made from stone or bone. Knives were sharpened or replaced. Awls for punching holes in leather were carved, from bone and polished smooth. Clothing was repaired. Moccasins wore out quickly and needed constant attention. Holes were patched. Seams were resewn and new soles were attached. Shirts and leggings were inspected for damage and mended. New clothing was also made. If a hide had been tanned during the previous season and set aside, winter was the time to cut and sew it into garments. Children grew and needed larger clothes. Adults needed replacements for items that had worn beyond repair. All of this work served a dual purpose. It prepared the family for the coming spring, when they would return to a mobile existence and would need functional equipment, and it filled the long hours of winter, providing meaningful activity that kept hands busy and minds engaged. The work was not rushed. There was time to do things properly, to pay attention to details, to create objects of quality. Winter was the season for refinement, for taking raw materials and transforming them into tools, clothing and art,